Bem-vindos e bem-vindas de volta.
Welcome back.
Peço a todos que tomem seus lugares.
Please find your seats so we can resume.
Antes de seguirmos com a programação do evento,
Before we go on, I would like to invite you to watch one of the several videos that we have for the celebration of our 15 years.
Por favor.
O seminário está comemorando o seu
The seminar is celebrating its 15th anniversary with a huge audience, which proves its success and the confidence that everyone has about the seminar, which shows that privacy and data protection are themes which are so relevant, also with several novelties which require a further debate. The seminar was a stage for several discussions, initiatives, and developments which led to the development of new policies and norms and standards. And we hope that the seminar will be a room for maturing open dialogue, which is diverse, multi-stakeholder, where we replicate information and knowledge.
Passamos agora para a nossa primeira palestra principal.
Now let's proceed to our first lecture with our keynote, Ashta Kapoor, who will address democratizing the social value of data. Could you please join us? And Caitlin will be our moderator, and you have the floor. Thank you.
A introdução mais completa de nossa keynote poderá ser feita pela nossa facilitadora moderadora.
Our moderator will introduce our keynote speaker.
Conduzir a nossa primeira palestra principal.
You may go on, please, Caitlin.
Muito obrigada, Pedro.
Thank you, Pedro.
Essa é a nossa primeira mesa com
Our first panel
muito
has
especial,
a very special keynote speaker who is an Indian researcher which conducts not only researches but a number of several important work on data privacy and promoting personal data protection to the well of everyone, common well, and she is the founder of Apti Institute. This is an institute which is based in India and performs a number of projects and researches on personal data protection. Ashta will have 30 minutes for her talk. Following that, we are going to open for a discussion, a dialogue for half an hour, and later we are going to open for the audience for your questions. Next, I would like to then hand over the floor to our keynote speaker, and thank you so much for the opportunity to hear you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real privilege to be among all of you as you go through the 15th anniversary of this event. As Caitlin said, I'm Ashta Kapoor. I'm one of the co-founders of APNI Institute. And I am going to be talking through a short presentation to think about how do we democratize the value of data. And I must warn you that I'm not a lawyer, so this is a social science perspective on data, so please bear with me. But I'm sure there are many lawyers in the audience who could make up for what I lack. So as we said, like, this is about democratizing the value of data. Everybody knows this man, obviously. But why I brought him here, of all the places, is because this is something that we need to think about, which is that, you know, in this whole rush for AI, what is Mark Zuckerberg doing? Mark Zuckerberg is obviously acquiring stakes in companies that, that make data available. So there's a company called Scale.ai that actually is just very high-value data labeling. And, you know, Meta has just bought an enormous amount of stake in it for, what is it, $15 billion. And what we're learning is that, you know, there's a shift. I mean, the conversation today is about personal data, but I think there's obviously a tectonic shift that's happening in how we view data, how we use it, and what we do with it, right? And so you'll see that even, you know, a statistic that's being thrown around, and I love fun facts, and this is one of them, which is that for every dollar that you spend on making AI, 20 cents is being spent on data. That is acquiring data, cleaning data, labeling data, all of the things that we think about, but a lot of money in the AI context is going on that. Which brings me to the point that, you know, what is data? Data acts as a competitive moat for big tech companies. And it's involved in, obviously, like, what we're seeing is this enormous and rapid acceleration in the way that data is being generated. So ChatGPT reached 1 billion searches 5.5 times faster than Google did. There's also a lot of, like, consolidation of data power. I mentioned how Mark Zuckerberg has acquired a stake in Scale.ai. This behavior is not new. We know that there's this thirst for data that big tech keeps searching. So Google bought over Fitbit, which means all the sort of wellness data that we've all been generating on our devices is now with Google. And also the other thing is that, you know, it's not just acquisitions, but strategic contracts as well. So OpenAI has a contract with Condé Nast, which is one of the biggest publications in the US, that owns a bunch of magazines, and to share data, because they realize that, you know, maybe this is not going to be easy and accessible, so the best way to do it is to pay for it and get out, right? And the last thing is that we also are seeing that a lot of data is being scraped without our consent, without our knowledge. So, you know, everyone says, like, 70% of ChatGPT is Reddit. So all of this is happening without us necessarily thinking about. And this has implications on how we think about privacy, obviously. It has implications on how we think about innovation. And innovation not like who's going to make the next ChatGPT, but innovation for countries like ours, India and Brazil, where there are smaller entrepreneurs that are struggling to build interesting products because they don't necessarily have the access to data that we need. And then it also has implications on our sovereignty, which is, are we able to negotiate with American big tech while safeguarding our own sovereign interest, and how we do that meaningfully. And especially as India and Brazil both have the rare camaraderie of being in the 50% plus tariffs with the US, I think that this is something for all of us to think about together. As we sort of like move, So therefore, I think there's a need to reimagine data, not just as personal data rights, but to have a much more bigger, holistic view of it, which is that data is not just data rights, but it is a much more broader infrastructural question, right? So it is to be concerned or thought about as infrastructure. And the reason for that is that, you know, what are the characteristics of infrastructure? Infrastructure addresses societal needs. So we can see that data does do that by enabling social interactions, economic progress, you know, public service delivery. We also know that it's necessary for systemic functioning, which is that all digital services and interactions rely on data. It facilitates further production. That's another feature of infrastructure, which is that data-driven insights can power businesses, the government to do much more, right? It's not just an artifact, it's infrastructure, so you can build on it. It's dynamic and linked, so data in and of itself is not useful, but as we think of it as dynamic, as linked, as something that sort of grows and evolves, it is valuable. So we know that data sets overlap within themselves and rely on supporting networks to create value. There's imbibed modularity, so you can stack it up in different ways, so it's non-rivalrous, it's plugged in different contexts, so you could have, as we were saying, Fitbit data that can also be used to think about insurance, right? And then finally, it generates externalities, right? Which again is a non-rivalrous question, which is that a data set can have a bunch of different uses that create externalities around it. So as we move on from this idea that data is indeed infrastructure, what we realize is that we are still thinking about, as a community of people who thinks about the value of data, who thinks about protection, who thinks about how to safeguard it, we actually have a fairly myopic view in terms of how we govern it, right? And some of this was discussed in the beginning panel as well, is that when we think about, so if you look at all the things that we need to govern data for, right? We need to govern it for security, we need to govern it for protections, which we talk about, right? But we also need to govern it for participation, for sovereignty, as I mentioned, for markets, because again, so much market power is being hoarded from the data perspective. And then we also need to think about public good. So, how do we unlock the value of data for public good? If you look at all, If you look at all our regulations, they're focused only on two buckets, which is security and protection. And I think some of that was talked about. And as I was saying to Caitlin over coffee, is that I think we need to start thinking, and this is a cricketing analogy, but like on the front foot about data, we need to start thinking about how to be less defensive in terms of only thinking about protection, but start to think about data much more as infrastructure, much more as something that we claim against. As we move forward, we realize that this has an impact on our ability to exercise agency, right? So if you look at, for individuals and communities, what are the big concerns? It's privacy, agency and control, but also public good, right? We need to be able to think about our data as something that we can deploy for public good. I come from a city which has an enormous traffic problem. I'm in a car all the time, which is creating a lot of data. I should be able to unlock that value of the data for solving the traffic issue, but I have no means to do that. Similarly, we know that there's a communal part to data, right? Which is that communities, data is relational, it impacts not just me, but the communities I inhabit. And it's important to think about data as that communal good. But again, we don't have instruments to do so. So all we have is consent models, which are, as we've learned, not as useful as they used to be. And we also have some data protection models, which again are not sufficient in the way that data is being currently structured. In fact, one of the sort of like big figures of data rights, Daniel Solov, has been calling for this big privacy rethink, right? We need to rethink how we think about privacy. Then for states, we know that data has value in terms of national strategy. So all the stuff that we've heard about, data for policy, data for public good, how do we make more data-driven decisions? These are all things that governments talk about. And then there's also national security, which is that, we need to safeguard our sensitive data, our financial transactions, our health data, and things like that. But the frameworks that we have are things like data localization, which some countries do, some countries don't do. And again, data localization comes with its own sort of can of worms. We also have sort of governance around cross-border data flows, but again are fairly nascent in most parts of the world. And then we have a new sense of things that governments have started to do, which is things like sovereign cloud systems, which again, in very many instances are dependent either on big tech companies to provide. So I'm sure people have read things that are coming out of Europe, which is that Microsoft is enabling parts of Europe to create their own sovereign clouds, right? So there's both an infrastructural gap in terms of how we can exercise sovereignty as well as a regulatory gap in how we do it. And then finally for businesses, there's questions of market access. So what happens to the little entrepreneurs that want to build? What happens for general innovation and efficiency? And again, so much of it is dependent on current infrastructures of big tech that we're not necessarily able to draw value from it. And similarly, you realize that like there's only competition and antitrust, but again, many countries, including my own, haven't necessarily done that meaningfully because we don't have the ability to think about things like contracts and acquisitions, and even like what Meta has been doing in terms of acqui-hires, right? We're not acquiring the products, we're just acquiring the brains that make the products. So there's a lot that we miss out in terms of how bigness is being supported in our current climate. We miss out on the fact that we have to think a little bit differently about the question of data, and we're doing ourselves a disservice by only focusing on privacy. I think we need to have a much more aggressive and redistributive stance on data that impacts not just our own privacy, but also how we think about public good, how we think about community negotiation, and how we think about the collective value of data. So at Aapti for the last 5 years, we've been sort of noodling around on an idea called data stewardship. So if you look at data sharing, which is like the first step that all of us understand, is really just focused on the extraction of data, making sure that data is shared through bi-party data sharing agreements, user consent is not meaningful, and value extraction occurs, right? So this is the journalists of Condé Nast writing their stories, but Condé Nast as a company has gone and had a relationship with OpenAI without necessarily thinking about the consent of the journalists themselves. And this happens, again, at the level of the companies to all of us, but increasingly more so. So that's a sort of like step one, which is a lot of where the world is right now. Step two is in the sort of data governance layer, which is where a lot of the conversation today has been, which is, okay, if step one is the wild, wild west, where like no rules apply and people can do whatever they want, how do we think about rules of data governance? So how do we make sure there's compliance? How do we make sure that there's like some degree of agency anchored in consent and notice to data subjects, and how do we think of protection as the major sort of mainstay of how we deal with a governance ecosystem on data. And then finally, the sort of vision that we imagine is a much more negotiated space, is a much more sort of tussle for power effort, which is data stewardship, which is like how can we make sure that there's accountability and agency in the context of data sharing and governance. Sharing is driven not just like in general, but by specific purposes. And how do we make sure that we have collective bargaining around data? So as we've been saying, data is not just about individuals, it's about all of us. So how do we make sure that we also have the ability to negotiate around that? And then finally, the core purpose becomes empowerment and not just value extraction. And I know this sounds a little bit like, too utopic and probably not feasible. But I think that the situation that we're in right now, I maintain that the current frameworks are insufficient. And therefore, it is possible for us to think about a much more collective and negotiated space that is actually looking at more than just protections. And we're not alone in thinking about this. There are many examples around the world that do this. We've seen that data stewardship and data governance can coexist. So if we do data stewardship right, what we could do is actually we can have a situation in which we have a way of making data flow for different stakeholders, right? So for the government, you can deploy data in pursuit of public interest. For researchers and nonprofits, like many in the room, you can deploy data again in pursuit of public interest, but also for advocacy purposes for citizens, because so many of us represent that through our work. For businesses, you can use data to design last mile products that big tech is not necessarily thinking about, but also even the level playing field in very many ways. And then for citizens and communities, obviously there's increased agency over data, less extractive and value negotiation, right? And there are efforts that have happened. So in India in 2021, there was an effort called the Non-Personal Data Committee. It was a committee that was set up to advise the government. And for the first time, what they were talking about was the idea that, you know, there is something called community data, and that is data that we all have rights over. So how should we think about that? Obviously, community is a very hard thing to understand. Like, are we all in a community right now because there are CCTVs extracting our data right now? Or are we not in a community because we're all different and disparate? So what is a data community and how do we think about it were some of the questions. The Non-Personal Data Committee also talked about data mandates, which is that if the government thinks that a certain kind of data is high value for public interest, then it has the ability to mandate its sharing for public good. Again, these are tricky because, you know, governments can change form and flavor very quickly, as we all know. So how much do we empower institutions to do that? But what the Non-Personal Data Committee did is actually embarked upon an interesting question of what is possible and what we might be able to think about. Because if we do data stewardship meaningfully, we all get a car. Like, this is possible, right? Like, we can, why should data be something that is hoarded by a select few companies? Why is it something that is extracted against our consent? And why should we not be organizing and mobilizing around it in the way that we think is more meaningful? So that's the position that we've been trying to take. And what we've done over the last 5 years is try to discover models that do this. They're all very small at the moment, and sustainability is an issue. But I think that what they do is they point us to the possibility that things are feasible in a way that is not necessarily defined by the very small view of like GDPR, right? Which thinks of data as individualized, as something that needs to be protected. And so we need to have a much more communal global south view, as Rafa and I were talking in the break, and also to Caitlin, is that, you know, we need to have a much more communal view of data, which is anchored in our own values. You know, I'm from India, and we're so many of us, and so people always say Indians don't value privacy because, you know, what privacy can you have when you are 10 people living in a house? Which obviously means that these are people who have not engaged with notions of privacy in the way that, you know, what it means for a woman to have privacy versus, you know, with her husband versus with the community. So the notions of privacy and protection, the notions of individualized protections are all anchored in certain values that are maybe not necessarily reflected in our own lived experiences. So what we need to think about is how do we reflect our own sort of communal lives which are interconnected into our governance of data, which needs to straddle some of that lived experience. So with that, I'll just take you through a few models of how data stewardship is being done globally. These are not perfect, like I said, these are not absolute, and these are definitely struggling in terms of making themselves sustainable, because so much of this is about how do we find funding for some of these interesting models, but still worth poring over. Oh, sorry. So there are lots of different models, right? And some of you may have come up against them. So the ones that I like the most are called data cooperatives. Again, in places like India and Brazil, we have a really long culture of co-ops. Cooperatives already pool their labor and capital. And so what we've been trying to understand is how we can get co-ops to pool their data as well. So we've been working with cooperatives in India as well as in parts of Africa to see if, you know, women's cooperatives in particular can be enabled to collectivize the data that they generate. So for instance, I'll give you an example out of India where there's a cooperative of women that actually has 4,000 members, but they don't have mechanisms of collectivizing that data for the members and advocating for, say, better financial services for their community, right? So they just get really terrible deals from the banks, even though their own lives and the way that they do agriculture is shared, But the way that the government sees them is individualized, your digital ID number, your bank account. But when they leave that sort of way of government seeing them, they have collective lives. They steward the land together, right? So how should we start thinking about data also as that collective mean? So we've been doing some work with a co-op in Western India that is now, unfortunately, like collecting individualized data and then collectivizing it and then using that as a way of bargaining with financial services institutions for better products, right, that are much more tuned to their lived experience. We've also seen examples out of all the places, California, of drivers coming together and setting up a cooperative, and these are drivers that work on multiple apps, and there's a cooperative, or it no longer exists, it was called Driver's Seat, which helped drivers collectivize the data and gave them all insights, so you could understand, okay, I'm going to take route A, should I take Grab or should I take Lyft? Because what platforms do is they invisibilize that intelligence and you don't necessarily get any value back. We've also seen, data trusts, which again are very popular at the moment in the EU, and they keep coming up in various kinds of governance documents. They're complex instruments, but worth trying, and there are some pilots that exist. There was also an interesting case out of the Netherlands, filed by an organization, a workers' union called Worker Info Exchange, which used the right to port that GDPR has to port their data into a worker-owned cooperative. So, and I know that there's a lot of work happening in Brazil in terms of worker-owned platforms as well. And so there are personal data stores, there are account aggregators, there's collaboratives, exchanges, and I'll get in commons, and I'll get into some of these a little bit more. This is an example from India. Like I said, it's not perfect. This is called a consent manager. What it does is that and we've seen this in versions in X-Road in Estonia as well. But what it does is that if you have a health information user, say like an insurance company, and you have a hospital on the other side, which is the health information provider, it has an encrypted data flow, which is a consent layer, and the individual has the ability to consent to very granular information, such as I want to share my health records between 2010 and 2012, but not before or after, for instance. Or I want to share my health records about my pregnancy, but not about my COVID. So there are ways of negotiating that. So what this does is it gives the individual a very specific level of consenting for very specific purposes. But again, the problem with this is that this assumes that there's power in the hands of the individual and that consent is a useful tool to negotiate power. However, if you're sick and you need insurance and your insurer is asking you for all your data, you're more likely to just consent, right? So one of the concerns in this model is that over-consenting is occurring. And the other issue is that while it solves for transparency and maybe a certain degree of accountability, it doesn't solve for power. Right? So we've been trying to think about how the consent manager framework can actually be used for an effort of collectivizing as well. So is it possible that there's a consent manager that actually works with all the Uber drivers to make sure that their data is being consented to together, and they have the space to negotiate with platforms. So this is a consent manager. We've already implemented this in the financial services, and we're also looking, this model is from the health services, so we're also looking to, and when I say we, I mean the government of India. This is a model called Safety Pin. This is built off an open data platform, which is the Indian Urban Data Exchange, which is a government platform that looks at all the smart cities data. But what they've done is Safety Pin is a non-profit that looks at women's safety, and they've actually built on top of that. So what they've done is they've got citizen-generated insights that actually mark areas as safe or unsafe for women. And what the platform does is combines this into, meaningful insights for women traversing. So you'll be able to see, this is not a very clear picture, but like, did you feel safe? So this is about straddling that lived experience of women onto the data platform and giving value back. So the idea of democratizing value is very different in different instances, and I think that we're also always stuck in this notion of the fact that value is monetary, but I think that we have to crack open what that value is. Sometimes value is privacy, sometimes value is the right to say no to certain kinds of sharing. Sometimes value is like trying to be able to get insights that other platforms don't give you. So there are notions, so this is inclusive, and it's collectively stewarded by women themselves, and then the platform is giving insights back. And then finally, this is a model that looks, this is from South Africa, this is called Abalobi. This is a platform that has been built and governed by fisher people, so it's a social enterprise that looks at participatory action for small-scale fisheries farmers. And so they have monthly data meetings to collect data from the communities, and then decisions about the data are made also collectively by the farmer communities. So the nonprofit acts as a steward, and then insights are given back in terms of, you know, health of the ecosystem where they fish. Insights are given back on better market linkages, which otherwise would have been not possible for small fishers. And they also find basis of participation. So they use a lot of things like comics and things, because data is really boring and nobody wants to spend time looking at micro decisions around data, because again, there's a lot of sense of oh, everybody already knows everything about me, so why do I need privacy? Everybody, you know, what value can I extract from my data? So Abalobi does a lot of effort around demonstrating the value of data and then creating this fisheries community to steward its data more meaningfully. And then I think what we've been trying to do, and I wanted to pause here to also encourage how we think about this together, because what we've been doing is we're a research firm. So we do a lot of research to discover all of these efforts. We've just been working in Southeast Asia to look at how climate action is actually a data question that a lot of communities are stewarding. So how can you sort of negotiate using instruments that you have, like carbon credits, which I'm sure is a very useful, you know, example in Brazil as well. So how can communities think through collective action on that? How can, you know, we know that there are communities in Indonesia where women are going and taking photos of deforestation and using that as collective evidence to hold their local governments accountable. So all of this is data questions, and we need to make sure that we have robust research on these small examples that actually can have a lot of value for how the rest of us think about data. And a lot of them are bottom up. A lot of them are being driven by communities. So I think that there's labor to be done in terms of visibilizing some of that. There's a lot of work that we do on pilots, like I said. So sometimes you have a good idea that needs to be expanded. So how do we make sure that we are able to constantly test and not get ossified in a singular kind of approach? I think that the whole AI conversation is moving so fast that we need to be very nimble and make sure that we're testing very quickly and thinking about different approaches. And then finally, you know, a lot of this is about organizing, and I know that it's a hard one to do, but I think that, you know, communicating the value of data to people is really, really necessary, because what we've realized is that if you spend 2 days in any community talking about the value of data, there's an immediate clicking that happens and people are willing to come together around it. So I know this might sound a little bit harebrained, but I think that there is value in still thinking about a movement around the value of data. I think that there's a lot of general sense that this is going to come around from governance, but the way that the conversation has been progressing globally, I think that we need to have much quicker turnaround, and that comes from making sure that we understand how data is being extracted, how it's being used, what are the harms that come from it, not as a notional way, and how do we think of a much more collective approach around that. So I'll pause there with an eye on the clock as well. You know, please reach out and would love to talk if there are examples that you have or things that you'd like to see more of, happy to share. So thank you so much.
Bom, depois dessa
Well, after
palestra absolutamente
this
maravilhosa,
amazing talk,
eu não vou ousar uns 5 minutos de uma fala que
I
pode conectar a realidade
will
brasileira
briefly
com a
share
realidade
some
mundial. E a
comments about the
realidade do
Brazilian
sul global,
reality,
como
which
eu
may be
mencionei
connected
na
to the
mesa de
Indian
abertura.
reality and also
E
be
nesses 5
related to the
minutos eu
global
queria fazer
South. But
algumas
I will be very
pequenas
brief, just 5
ponderações em
minutes,
cima
where I would like
da
to make some
palestra
comments
excelente da
about
Ashta.
this
A primeira
excellent
delas
talk
é
given by Ashta.
voltar um pouco no
First of all,
tempo
let's go
para
back in
tratar de
time
autores que não
and talk
necessariamente
about some
estudaram dados
players or
pessoais,
authors who
mas que
not
foram
necessarily
fundamentais, são
addressed personal
fundamentais
data
para que a
information,
gente
but
possa
still
construir
they are
uma
important
ideia de
players to help
dados
us
para o
in
bem
the
comum.
construction of
Eu estou falando bem
building up
devagar
data
para que
for the
a
common good.
tradução
I'm
possa, de
speaking
forma bem
slowly
adequada,
so we
trazer
know
as
we can
ideias
help
para
with the
a Ashta.
translation.
Desses autores, vou fazer
One
uma
of the
contraposição aqui
authors,
muito rápida. Quando a gente pensa em
I mean, let me
privacidade
go
de
back.
dados,
Anything
privacidade e proteção de
addressing
dados,
data privacy
a gente tem
and
uma
data
perspectiva original que
protection,
é uma perspectiva
we
burguesa.
have a
Ashta
more
falou como
Borghese
pensar em
perspective. How
privacidade
can we think
num
about
ambiente em que
privacy
10
on
pessoas
a
vivem
place
juntas
where
num
10 people
quarto?
live together
Então, a
in one
privacidade, ela
single
nasce
room?
numa concepção
Privacy then
absolutamente
is raised
burguesa
from that
capitalista. E o que isso
capitalist
tem a ver com a
perspective.
fala do bem
And
comum?
what is the
Se
relation
nós
to the common good
formos
talk?
investigar autores
If we
italianos,
would
e aí eu vou sair do
investigate
sul global,
some
tá, gente?
Italian
Infelizmente, mas tem
players,
um
and now
autor
I'm no
italiano
longer
que eu
talking about the
considero muito
global south,
importante,
but there
que
is
trata
a
da ideia
very
comunal,
important
que é o
Italian
Antônio
author
Negri, a
who is
quem eu
Antonio Negri.
recomendo a leitura.
And I would
O
recommend you
Negri,
all
que
reading
não é da área de
Negri's
tecnologia, de proteção de
publications.
dados,
He's
ele
not from
desenvolveu uma
technology,
ideia de
neither data
comuns.
protection field,
E aí a
but
ideia
he
de
has
comum, dos
developed the
comuns,
idea
é
of a
uma ideia
common
que nós
good.
podemos
And this is an
apropriar quando
idea which we
falamos de
may
data commons,
use
o
in
dado
the
comum, comunal,
data
utilizado
commerce,
para
the
a
common data,
promoção de
which
direitos.
is used
E eu
for
acho que
promoting
nós, no
our
Brasil e em outros
rights.
países,
And not
aí
only in Brazil,
certamente
but in other
também
countries such as
segue essa
India
linha,
and
nós
others
pensamos
that
muito na
follow the
proteção
same
de
line,
dados
where we
como
emphasize the
uma
data
forma de
protection
tutela de
as being
direitos e
a
não de
way of
promoção de direitos.
rights and not a way to
Ou seja, nós
promote
ainda estamos
rights.
muito
We
presos
are
numa concepção
still
tradicional de que a proteção de
thinking about
dados se
that
refere
traditional
a
concept
riscos,
where data protection
segurança,
refers to risks, security,
proteção dos direitos de uma forma um pouco passiva
data
e
rights
menos de
protections
promoção.
in a more
Então,
passive
eu
manner
acredito
rather
que
than
a fala da
promoting
Ashta
and
nos
advocating
ajuda a
for those
compreender
rights. And after
como
your
o uso de
talk,
dados de
we
forma
may better
coletiva,
understand how
ou se nós pudermos usar esse
the
termo, uma
collective
coletividade dos
use
dados,
of data, where there is
pode
a collection
funcionar como
of
uma
data, and
forma
how
de
can
promover
that
direitos
work as a
fundamentais,
way to
direitos
promote
humanos
essential
das
human
pessoas e
rights
trazer a
to
essas
people,
pessoas uma soberania em
and
relação aos
somehow
seus
to
próprios
allow
dados.
more
Mais uma vez,
sovereignty
como
to
a Ashta
those
muito bem
regarding
colocou,
their
não um
own
valor
data,
necessariamente econômico,
not
apesar de nós sabermos que esse
necessarily
valor
being an
econômico existe,
economic value,
mas
despite
uma
knowing
ideia de
that
um
there is
valor
an existence
inerente à
of this
própria
nominal value,
dignidade
but a
das
value
pessoas e
that
da
should be
comunidade envolvida
intrinsic and part
naquelas
of the
relações.
community or those
Já
who
falei
are
demais, a
part of the
palestra é da
relationship.
Ashta, então eu
Well,
vou
I spoke
trazer
far too
algumas
much.
perguntas que
Now
nós
I would like
preparamos
to
juntas
ask
para que
some
ela possa
questions so
desenvolver
she
de uma
can
forma mais
elaborate a
efetiva.
little
Eu
bit
vou
more on
fazer essas
her
perguntas em
answers.
inglês
So I will
para
ask the
facilitar a
questions in
compreensão
English.
da Asta.
So you may remove the
The first
headsets
question
now
is,
if you
Asta,
want.
do you agree that data should be treated as a form of public infrastructure? You told us about the public infrastructure now on your lecture, but what would be the benefits and the risks of such a classification?
I actually do think that data should be treated as infrastructure, largely because I think the idea of infrastructure brings with it the ability for us to make claims as well as to collectively govern. One of the examples of infrastructures is things like roads. We know that if roads are broken, if they are not being maintained by the government, which is responsible for this public infrastructure, then we have the space to go and complain. We have the space to hold the government accountable for making sure that these roads work better, right? And it is something that impacts all of us, and so therefore we can do it collectively, so it's a site for collective action. Similarly, I think that data also should be thought about in that, and I also think that, I mean, we've been developing the idea of the right to infrastructure, which actually comes with, you know, a set of demands that we should think about, which is small things like no marketization. You talked about the capitalist impetus around individual rights. I think the other capitalist impetus is to marketize things like data, right? So if we have a singular right to infrastructure, then we can talk about what we want from it, which is that we don't want our data to be commodified, or we want it to be, you know, pushed to public value. Similarly, things like we want, as part of that right to infrastructure and thinking about data as infrastructure, we can ask for things like co-design, which is that, you know, no decisions about us should be made without us, which is a very simple principle of data justice. But I think that only if we take, like you said, a less passive approach to rights and an infrastructural approach to data can we start to ask for these things. And therefore, I think that the reframing is important, largely because the conversation is being pulled away from us, and also that there is infrastructural value that is being derived from data. It's just that we don't have a say in it. So how do we think through that is what we've been advocating for, is data is infrastructure, and we actually have a right to that infrastructure.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. Second question is, which approach do you think better balances innovation with individual rights, data governance, or data stewardship, which is a concept that it is new for us, right? I would call it in Portuguese, maybe curadoria, which is you have a curator, maybe, who knows. But does data stewardship depend on digital literacy? I think so. What do you think about it?
So I think that, first of all, this is again the lies they tell us, right? Like that innovation and protection, so innovations and individual agency cannot go together. I think that the question is innovation for who? Right? The innovation, if ChatGPT is the innovation for us, then we should be able to draw value from it. Similarly, I think that, to me, approaches like ABA Lobby that I presented is innovation. It is with us, it has been developed with the communities that it impacts. It is developed to create value for the communities. So I think that this whole sort of notion of that protection and innovation don't go together. And we've heard this all the time, right? Like, oh, too much governance will hamper innovation. But actually what we've seen is that innovation of the small businesses in places like India and Brazil is already being hampered because data is being hoarded, right? We do need governance to make sure that innovation for us, by us, is being facilitated. We do need better innovations around competition and antitrust and governance around that. So that's the sort of question on individuals versus innovation. And then the second part of it is, I think, on who stewards. I think we steward. We, like I said, there have been this whole thing that has been always said that, oh, you know, this is a technical thing that only a certain people understand, that it needs literacy, it needs capability. But we all know the value or the harms that are coming from data, right? You guys talked about the work that's happened in Brazil in terms of protection for children. We know what happens to people who get denied credit because of poor algorithms on credit scoring. We know what happens on things like basic access and insurance when decisions are being made. So I think that the harm is being felt. I think, to me, it's a question of how do we create the institutional mechanisms to do this, which is the role of, I think, the researchers, the nonprofits, the lawyers in the room. And there are lots of interesting initiatives that are happening. So in the same way that there are, pro bono services for lawyers, there are now, out of King's College, there are pro bono services being put out for data rights questions as well. So I think much like in any movement building, we need to think of various different approaches. Literacy of it's part of it, but we need to think of what the institutional action is and what can we do to think about institutions that already exist, like in our case, the co-ops, to transform them to become stewards, or the non-profits or the researchers. I think that's what is the work in some ways, which actually is a much quicker turnaround than a bigger sort of like, oh, we need a digital literacy program. I think that there's smaller things to be done that can quicken the action towards stewardship.
Thank you, Ashta. The next question, how could, and this is a very important question because I think it's something that everyone here is struggling with, that is consent management, right? So how do you think that models like consent managers or trusted data intermediaries improve user agency, and what limitations might remain?
So I think the consent manager, as I presented, is an interesting format, which it allows for individuals to have granular, revocable consent. Like I said, currently in the financial services and then also in the health sector. I think that it's quite a useful instrument because I know that consent can be sometimes just sort of arm-twisted and gotten, or in many instances not got. But like I said, I think that it has its limitations. So when consent is given, there's no reasonable way of doing purpose limitation, right? So because the biggest sort of hindrance in a lot of data protection regulation, including ours, is that, once you consent, then the data is fair play. Right? So I think that purpose limitation is something to be considered. The second part of it is the very individual nature of consent. So again, it does believe that, consent is the way for individuals to have agency. And so if you give versus revoke, you should be okay. But again, it doesn't think about the power question at all, that individuals actually have no ability to exercise power, and that this is an effort to atomize our lived experiences and to reduce it to like a yes-no. But consent is a very complicated thing. I may consent to receiving insurance, but I may not consent for that data to be used to, typify women in their 30s and deny or give them, which is what happens. Or I may not consent for that data to be sold to a data broker who then uses it to defraud people, right? So there's a lot that the consent managers are only just flow of consent versus any other meaningful way. And I think that the lessons from India are actually to take maybe some of that technical architecture, but again, think of it as a much more in context what that means. And I think the effort in India is also to do that, which is, yes, consent flows are important and we need to fix those, but then how do we design the architectures of protection and collective bargaining that are necessary to make sure that once we consent, we still have a say in how that data is being used, for instance.
Do you think that the principles of data protection, for instance, purpose, minimization, are enough for that purpose? For instance, thinking about you can consent with the use of your data, but only for a purpose. Is that enough?
Probably not. It's a start, which is why I think that we do, and I keep coming back to this, is that we do need collective bargaining around this. So for instance, if a bank is found to be selling data to data brokers, or if then we need to be able to organize around it and ask for action. And I think that only happens if there's an institutional mechanism. So obviously consumer protection, and I know IDEC is in the room, but like consumer protection organizations are one way of doing it. But then there is a need to think of much more other institutional mechanisms to do that. We've been sort of noodling around with a way that if the consent manager itself becomes that point of collectivization, so if I become the consent manager for this room, right, then I have a lot of strength to say yes or no on behalf of this room because I am the fiduciary for the room.
That's great. So you think about that as a collective right and not an individual right.
Yeah. So you pool individual rights into a collective right.
Okay, that's great. That's great. So you brought some examples from India and from Africa about like innovative models. And I think to what extent those models could transfer to another country context like Brazil or the global south? Do you think that's possible, considering all the legal, social, and technological frameworks differences that we have in our countries?
I mean, we in India look at Brazil very much as an example to be studied, only because I think that so much of organizing and mobilizing of collective rights has happened out of Brazil. I think that there's an enormous sense of public good and public action that, so I think a short answer is that I think Brazil is ripe for very innovative models, at least in the way that we understand it, because it has retained so much of its, institutional infrastructure in terms of the value of unions, the value of co-ops, the role of the indigenous communities, which are all very shared and communal rule sets. And I think it's a question of adding that data question around that. So it may be naive and coming from a lack of understanding of the context, but just as an outsider, I look at some of the institutional approaches that Brazil has already done in very many different, even in contexts such as culture and, public spaces. We don't have that. So we actually do, as India, very poorly on a lot of this, right? We've managed to completely kill off our union movement, for instance, which remains very relevant in Brazil even now. So I think that there are opportunities to challenge some of the capitalist approaches to data rights through much more cooperative approaches to data rights, and I think Brazil would be a great place for some of that. We, of course, in India have been talking a lot to the Brazilian government on things like digital public infrastructure, and I think Brazil has been, at least basis what we've studied, been very good about taking what the Brazilians need from that digital public infrastructure and adapting it to context.
Thank you, Ashta. I think that DPI in Brazil is very innovative, right? When you have the Gov.br and Cadastro Único and the PIX, for instance, they're very good examples of how to use data for the common good, right? And in a federal government. So the last question, Ashta, is your presentation suggests that data stewardship can be leveraged for public good. We understood that perfectly. But what about the challenges? What kinds of challenges arise from in ensuring that those initiatives are inclusive and they are sustainable? I think that's the big question, right?
Sustainability is a really big question because we know that the business model of the internet is surveillance and selling ads and doing all of that. So if you're trying to create a model that doesn't do that, then the question of how we generate money from that is always tricky. So sustainability is obviously a big challenge. We've looked at various models of sustainability, so which don't involve monetizing data, right? Because the easiest thing would be to start to pool data and start to sell it to people we know and like, which is a good way of doing. But I think that there are models such as, is it possible to do member fees? So if you are a member of a data cooperative that is stewarding your data on your behalf and getting you value in the form of better services or better privacy or better negotiation, do you start to sort of do in the way that we do with unions or even co-ops is member fees, right? This is something that we've looked at a little bit, and I think that may be the way to do it in some shape and form. But I have to say that the place that we find the most hard to solve is this question of sustainability, which is why so many models are either donor funded in the form of non-profits, which is not ideal, or they try to fund themselves and then they die over time. So, and also the other issue is scale, which is that a lot of these models lend themselves really nicely to smaller communities, but how do you think about scale? So if it's ABBA Lobby and it's a fishing community of 5,000 people, yes, you could make that very participative and make sure that you meet 5,000 people on a monthly basis and do all of that, but then how do you think of scale? In that context again, and this is me sort of revealing my own enthusiasm around cooperatives and their federated structure is quite a useful thing. So, I'm sure most people know, but like in Spain, there's an $11 billion business which is basically run as a co-op called Mondragon, right? They run schools, they run petrol stations, they run everything, but it's still structured as a federated cooperative. In India, milk is entirely owned and governed via cooperative structures. So if such large items can be stewarded through that structure, then sure, data can as well. And then the last one is, I think, this sense of being organized around it. We have been told that it is possible to exercise your data rights on your phone by, clicking cookie whatever notifications. And so this constant sense of this veneer of being in control and this veneer of like making sure that you as an individual are protecting yourself if you click no, I think that's what we have to shift as a much more ideological shift, which is that no, this is a communal thing that we need to show up for. And I think that is the harder part of this, is actually communicating the value of data and organizing people around that.
Would you say it's a form of resistance?
I would say so, negotiation. But yeah, I think the right to say no is very much part of that. And I believe that just because I'm saying no to giving a certain kind of ID, I'm still entitled to the value of that infrastructure, right? So you can't stop me from using the road, which is why you can't stop me from accessing my government benefit, right? So how do we make sure that we have the space to even resist, which I think we've all lost, because there's this foregone conclusion that if you part with your data, you will receive goods and services at the end of it, and there's no other way to do this transaction. So, which is also why the reframing on infrastructure is that even as I say no, that doesn't change my access. Why should it? So I think that's where we are.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashta. Now we have half an hour for the public, for questions from the public. Estou falando inglês ainda. A gente tem mais meia hora. Nós temos mais meia hora para perguntas.
Now we have half an hour for questions from the audience. There's a microphone over there in the aisle, actually 2 microphones. So please, you can come up here and ask your questions directly to our speaker.
Ashta, first I would like to thank you for your presentation. It brought me lots of insights, so for me it was very meaningful and thoughtful. One of my biggest worries is sharing things, what's happening, like it's kind of a trend that parents, they expose the daily routines of their kids online so they can see like people, they have access to their pictures, to where they go, to the patterns that they, I don't know, like study, places that they can be recognized, and then these data can also be used against them. Was my question clear? Yep. Because currently there is an influencer here in Brazil that he's been talking about this, and he's been like, he said how this is negative to people, and he has received a lot of hate speech on his social medias. Then it's also a trend that but my master's degree, like my classmates, we have been working on.
I'll try to answer that, though I'm not sure. I'm less familiar with the Brazilian context on this front, but I think that this is something that is obviously coming up in very many places. There are efforts such as age tokens that are being developed in India and I know in Brazil as well. There's regulation around the age of consent in terms of, you know, when children are allowed to have, and social media accounts and things like that. Unfortunately, parents are the guardians, legal guardians of children for up until whatever 16, 18, whatever the age of consent is, and will have to be relied on to safeguard them. I think that this is about awareness, but this is also about, again, creating those institutional mechanisms. I know that, for instance, schools do a lot of effort around both awareness, but then also making sure that they steward the data of children in a meaningful way. And then there's parent-teacher associations that these are examples that have happened, again, in smaller instances in the UK, where not so much on social media data, but then also on school data, such as evaluations, which the government extracts to then make algorithmic decisions, which happen in the UK, right? Which is that AI models were developed basis evaluation data to assess children. And so the parent-teacher associations became the stewards of that data to negotiate with the government. So I think that this is a question of like awareness and also creating some of those institutional frameworks that allow space to push back.
Thank you, Ashta. Nós temos mais perguntas? Por favor.
Vou falar em português, então, já que você colocou.
So I'll speak in Portuguese.
Puder falar pouco mais devagar para ajudar a tradução.
So can you please speak slower so that you can help the interpreters? Okay, I can easily see how we can democratize the social value of data. When you have the community gathering data and using them on their own benefit. But at the end of your presentation, you also talked about the right of saying no to data collection. But today, there is a value that is and also concentrated in the hands of few people. So there's a lot of data being collected. So how can we take this value over? So I understand, or can we just deny having our data collected?
Thank you for that question. It is obviously a complex thing, and we have almost 15 years of hegemonizing of data ahead of us. I think there are different ways to do it. So, like I said, there's the regulatory part of it, which is let's start to address that data is actually a source of bigness, and that it impacts things like competition and rights and things like that. So there's the whole competition and antitrust part of it. And the other part of it is much more sort of bottom-up movement making around this. I think that, again, we've been told that there's no value to single people's data, or, like things like that. So, my view is that, yes, if we rephrase this as a right, then we can start to claim around it, and saying no is part of that. We know that efforts such as GDPR have got us to the strictly necessary cookies. I think that the next step is to start to push those boundaries as well. My biggest problem around all of this is that the loss of privacy and the loss of data seems to be a foregone conclusion, which is what we need to reframe. And I think that the collective action and collective bargaining is going to be a part of that effort. People are not, and we are seeing this, to the question of, like, children's data was not something that we were really talking about 5 years ago, but it's starting to come up. I think that hate speech was not something that we were talking about, or even like the role of grok and things like that. So I think there's a greater sense of harm around this, and therefore from that should likely emerge a set of actions that we can take to, quote unquote, resist some of this hegemony.
Obrigada pela pergunta. Por favor.
Thank you for your question.
Olá, Ashta. Aqui Fernanda.
Hello, this is Fernanda speaking. I am from Internet Lab. Thank you so much for your talk, very inspiring.
Uma colega do Sul Global.
As someone from the Global South, as you are, how do you see the geopolitical situation right now? Of which countries from the Global South, anytime they wanted to interrupt or maybe to set some boundaries in our platforms, and what we have been discussing a lot in Brazil is transparency and data sharing for allowing access for further research. And the government of the United States was very strong and hard with the tributes due to those measures. Simultaneously, we see a weakness of the multilateralism, which be a room for further discussion with the G20 and the BRIC countries discussing. But at the same time, the multilateralism, it's been highly pressured. What's your take on that? The need to democratize the public value of data, and what is your perspective within a geopolitical approach? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. I love the work of Internet Lab. And obviously, this is not a small question, and one that I agree with everything you said, right? This is a huge challenge to multilateralism. We were all at the at the Paris AI Summit, which was where J.D. Vance was talking big talk about like how regulation in Europe is hampering, the growth of American platforms. And I think we're going to start to hear some of, we already are. The US has a new AI policy, which is all about tying their industrial policy with their diplomatic thing, which is buy American goods and push that. We know that India and Brazil are at the receiving end of 50+% tariffs, so our ability to negotiate is highly diminished. But in that context, I think that there's a huge space for Global South to come together. I think this has happened in the past in different contexts. And I think that forums such as BRICS and maybe not G20, but definitely greater value on BRICS is reasonable. I know that India is doing an India AI Summit in February, which is also going to be a space for more Global South mobilization. And I also think that there's value in doing Global South civil society mobilization like we do with, Data Privacy Brazil, Paradigm Initiative, and APTI Institute are in, along with many other people, in a Global South Alliance. And so there is value in doing track 2, 2.0, kind of negotiations as well. I think my sort of view is that we'll have to do what a lot of other jurisdictions are doing. So Europe is doing Eurostat, which is also sort of walling up their infrastructure, right? And gating it for people they want. Africa is also doing a lot of work around Africa data sovereignty, which is how do you make sure that we retain the sovereignty of our data, we're able to draw value maybe financially or also to set people out. And I think there's value in doing some of that work out of the Global South as well, which is how do we safeguard our data resources? How do we trade on our own terms in some of this? It's just that the politics of different countries are so far apart. I can't imagine governments that are more further apart than India and Brazil when it comes to politically. So this is a huge concern, and I think it should be something that we need to do more research and writing around. I know that Delhi has been doing a lot of like soft power push with the DPI agenda, but there are no good ways. I think that the opportunity to collaborate is what we should be seeking to make sure that we have coordinated positions, but I mean, high tides all around.
Obrigada, Ashta. Passar agora para a Lauriane.
Thank you,
Tem uma
Ashta.
pergunta da audiência que está
We
nos
have
assistindo
a
pelo
question
YouTube.
from a participant who is remotely, who had joined us
Precisamos de
remotely.
microfone.
We do need a microphone.
Posso levar o meu aí, quer?
I may take my mic to you. No, that's not necessary.
Olá, pessoal, bom dia. Eu sou a Loriane, da assessoria
Hello,
CGI.br.
good morning. I am from the consultancy agency at NIC.br. We have two questions already addressed in English.
There is a global consent manager application using blockchain, so each individual can make who get access and uses its personal data. E o segundo é do professor Carlos Cablan. How can Brazilian institutions, ANPD, universities, NGOs, collaborate with organizations like APTI to localize and adapt these governance models?
On the blockchain one, I'm going to sit it out because I can't, I'm sure there are more experts in the room for it. I haven't studied it. It usually seems like the answers to everything is blockchain, so it may be true. But on the collaboration on governance, yes, absolutely. I think that this is something that, India's G20 presidency really opened up Brazil for us. I think that this has just given us the opportunity to learn so much and know that there are so many commonalities between our cultures and our way to do things. I know that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of alliance building work that's happening between India and Brazil. We know that this sort of movement of DPI from India and Brazil also offers a very interesting space for us to share findings and things like that. So short answer, I think that we should be doing more between civil society, universities, and we're very much open to those collaborations. But yeah.
Thank you, Ashta. Me pergunta aqui desse lado, por favor.
A gente fala em proteção de dados, a gente...
are here talking about data protection. Much we say about awareness, if we are having an effective and best use of the technology, and what to do with data which has already been collected. Well, with all of that in mind, let me ask you, awareness. We talk about from now on about the importance to teach and learn more about data. But has anyone thought about including in the school curriculum agenda children starting having children that should start having lessons about privacy, personal data? We have children who are 5 years of age who are navigating on the web, opening Facebook or other social media pages, and I've never seen anyone considering this type of involvement to start giving classes to children to include in the educational curriculum agenda while they are still in the elementary school, but they could be raised thinking about the importance of data protection, of what they can disclose or not disclose, not accepting all the terms or anything they see on their smartphone screens. Thank you.
No, I agree. I think it absolutely should be integrated in curriculums across schools. I think that, I'm sure everyone's read all of this, but like the people who build tech in Palo Alto don't send their children to schools that allow phones. They're, homeschooling them. So they obviously know some things that we don't necessarily fully know. And you're absolutely right. I think that schools and universities are certainly the right point. And to the earlier question on parents as well, I think that it is something that, you should talk about it as a parent, navigating this with your teens. But I think that it definitely is the right moment to introduce the idea of the right to privacy and what needs to be done to protect it. We don't see that enough in India, and we definitely have this sense of the online world being full of opportunities, because we've obviously not done very well to create jobs in the real world. So everyone is being trained to be an influencer, and that also represents a certain kind of aspiration from a very young age. I think that there is something to be navigated more critically around that. It's just that places like India, and maybe it's true for Brazil as well, live in such different realities based on where you go. So you can have, the third largest economy, but so much of it is also still living in the early 20th century. So how do we bridge that gap in terms of capacities? I agree, and would be very useful to think of a collaboration that does that in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Ashta. Se eu puder fazer pequeno adendo, a ANPD, o Ministério da Educação
ANPD, the Agency of Privacy Data and Educational Ministry, they have some initiatives where they intend to include digital literacy at schools. We had a first initiative which had prohibited the use of smartphones at schools, but to have this attempt at schools that will require additional efforts from the Ministry of Education and parents. I am a mother of 3 kids, and I control their smartphones use, but being by myself, that won't help. It's necessary to get further support. And in the curriculum, there is a right for digital use. So I think we should include that debate as part of schools and universities. Sorry to interrupt you and make this side comment. Thank you. We have another question.
We were just waiting for the others, but excited to ask you questions, as always. Eu vou mudar para o português. Ashta, é sempre prazer ouvi-la.
I will switch to Portuguese. It's always a great honor to hear you. You always emphasize the bottom-up idea, and you also emphasize the role of authorities to perform a more effective enforcement with other competitive entities, where you highlight the power of the market. You also address institutional enhancement. How can both the movements be aligned one to another? How can we have a more effective participation by the authorities, which will involve also the competitive authority? How can all these stakeholders get more bottom-up collaboration or contributions where they can have a more advanced perspective with a focus on the competitive authorities, but not only? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I should be learning from your work on all of this, but I'll try. I think that we've seen, at least in India, that authorities that do consultations from the very beginning do very well to develop policies. So an unrelated example, India has some of the most progressive net neutrality laws, largely because the authority, which is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, was built from the foundation of participation. So it was a consultative effort that brought academia and businesses that asked for a telecom regulatory authority, and then in its DNA is consultation. So it did the most interesting work around net neutrality, where because Facebook was coming in, with free basics and all the promise around that, and so it was, as early as 2014, we were able to have a very clear and consultations happened all over. This is, I think, an anomaly in the way that things happen, but we've been seeing a lot of work around public voices in AI and participatory citizen assemblies, and the role of not just the competition authority but most civil society organizations as well as municipal governments that do this work to make sure that there's cross-pollination of ideas. I think that one of the big issues that we face in India, and maybe that's the case, is that competition, for instance, is something that the courts look at, the competition committee looks like, the consumer protection looks like, so it just gets like fragmented. So I think that there's some effort to be done in terms of how do we break some of these silos, and how do we make sure that public participation is not done in this tokenized way, but something that is created as part of the process. We've struggled with this a lot in India because seemingly consultation happens, but it's a black box. Like you send comments in and we never hear back on what the comments are, whose views are reflected in the law versus not, and whose interests are being done. But I think asking for that transparency and ensuring, and I think that there's a lot on public voices that is coming out of places like the UK. So there was a wonderful initiative on understanding patient data that then got embedded in the NHS. So there are models for us to chase after potentially together. So, yeah.
Perfeito, Ashta. Nós vamos para a nossa última pergunta.
Wonderful. We are going to go now to our last question of the morning due to time constraints. Good morning. Nice to meet you again. She's speaking English.
Now switching to Portuguese.
And she has just switched to Portuguese. I'm sorry. My name is Rachel Rashid. I am a researcher at the University of Moscow. You showed a number of perspectives, but which are contradiction to the data storage by the state. Now let me ask you, how can the society behave to overcome those projects that are becoming more effective and strong as how to income due to data? That sounds as a speculation than a more solid proposal. I don't know if you got the question.
I know, scary question. Thanks for that. I mean, I focused largely on, very tactically focused on data capture by the private sector and avoided data capture by the state. So thanks for putting me on the spot. I think that is also obviously a big concern. And again, in the context of India, we are seeing that, data from the biometric identity systems, as well as in other instances, not just the state is not just hoarding the data and potentially misusing it for surveillance, but is also actually not using the data when it's necessary. So it's an example I give all the time, which is that during COVID, you know, there were shutdowns, and places like Bombay and Delhi, which have large migrant populations, people wanted to go back to their villages. So trains originated in Delhi and Bombay, but didn't know where to go because they didn't have the data. So we had lost trains in the thick of the COVID pandemic, which is a testament to the fact that the government has so much data, but then when it comes to actually using it, they don't necessarily think about it. No good answers on surveillance other than like we need to start to, you know, mobilize around that. And again, there are so many efforts globally that are doing it. But on how do you get the government to use data, I think they're more open to hearing that part out. So we've seen obviously multiple open data initiatives. We've seen the ability, you know, even basic things like digitalization, which, like I said, India lives in many centuries at the same time. So, you know, how do you make sure you digitalize data, it's standardized, it's interoperable and usable even by the government itself and then by other parts of the ecosystem. And I think, I mean, we struggle with this. India just has a data protection legislation which only has exceptions for the government, right? In this context, I think it's the job of all of us in the civil society to start asking the difficult questions like you've done today, and start to create much more global momentum around this. And this is the opportunity for Global South organizations to come together, Global South, you know, alliances to be built, and start to put pressure in places where some of the multilateral conversations are happening. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashta. Nós switching to Portuguese now. Nós terminamos essa palestra agradecendo.
We have just concluded this session, and we couldn't thank you enough for your talk, which was so inspiring to set the path, the future path. And now we'd like then to close this session. What are we going to have now? Lunchtime or coffee break? No, it's lunchtime. Okay. We are going to break for lunch, 2 hours lunchtime break. And you are, could you please now join us for a picture? So now we are going to break for lunch, and we will be back at 2 p.m. sharp, and lunch will be served next door. And you are all invited to join us. So please be back at 2 p.m. with our next panel addressing data protection at the different spheres of the public administration. See you soon, and take your belongings with you. Thank you and enjoy your lunch.